thank you to all of you for inviting me to be part of this really exciting conversation. I am just so in awe of the collaboration, the work that you've done together around really important goals like thinking about highlighting understudied languages and the implications for child language. And I'm hoping that when I talk a bit about what I see as threads that are common to all of your work, that perhaps you'll indulge me and I'll talk a little bit about my own Northern Oral Language and Writing Through Play project. And we can think about potential linkages there. So first, I want to say that this is a challenge that has guided my Now Play Northern Oral Language and Writing Through Play project. And I see that you, in all of your research that's been presented today, have done a fantastic job of addressing this challenge as well. How do we engage in assessments that stay true to the actual phenomena that we are assessing? How do we engage in assessment that doesn't actually change the phenomena? And so I see that the work that you have done, gathering folklore from community members, so you are working with real stories, real songs, authentic games, and so on from the communities in Shreya and Gideon's study, the language in action in Jessica's study and Joyce's study. Those are real interactions, adult-child interactions around books and other objects. The text leveling, you know, when you think about text leveling, you don't often think about context, but I was very excited to see that both groups have considered the social nature of reading and thinking about in what context do children make meaning of texts. So the notion of talk and talk around books is considered to be a social interaction and not just an interaction where you're analyzing text. I'm also very excited that the language that is being examined in the interactions is the spontaneous language of children. So it's not something that's guided through questioning and so on. So to me, all of you in your research that you have been working on have been addressing this challenge very, very admirably. I also think I see threads of the notion of place. When we construct place as a social construct, where we say that a home or a community or just a backyard, wherever children are interacting with adults, children are interacting with each other, place has a role in constructing who they are. And in our case, we're interested in language and literacy. So who they are as language and literacy learners, but also who they are as social beings within whatever context they are. And so I see that place has been very important as well, particularly in the folklore studies, because place constructs those, is the substance of those stories, thinking about the homes, what happens in the homes, what happens in relationship with nature. Relationships are also a very important part when we think about place. And so I see relationships between children and adults in Jessica and Joyce's examination of interactions. And even when the groups that were looking at text leveling were thinking about relationships, I thought it was very exciting to see the criteria that related to how the books are actually being used in particular contexts, not just focusing on the books themselves. And so I'm going to now talk a little bit about the Now Play project, and I'll try to make some connections as I go along. And I'm sure after I finish talking, I'll think about some more connections as well. But I also think that perhaps some of the aspects of language that we're looking at, particularly looking at child interactions in play, are something that are kind of exciting to as an extension of the really exciting work that you are all doing. So I'm just going to start by acknowledging the land on which I am now residing and on which the Now Play research takes place. It is all the land that is the ancestral territory of First Nations peoples. And the land that we now call Canada, that is part of the Now Play study, is in northern, what we now know as what we call Ontario here. So it's Treaty 9 land and Treaty 3 land. And then also northern Alberta, which is Treaty 6 land. And this is a picture of some of the beautiful scenery that we see in our Northern Oral Language and Writing Through Play study when we're flying in small planes to remote communities, remote Indigenous communities, where there are no roads except when those lakes that you see freeze over in the wintertime. One thing that I also find very exciting about the Talk Together study, the vision was to think about what is important, what is needed. And that's the same basis for the Now Play study. The kindergarten children are ages 4 to 5 and 6 years old in kindergarten in Alberta and Ontario, which are the two provinces where the study took place. The kindergarten and grade 1 teachers were saying, we don't know if the children are coming to our classrooms with the kind of language, with the sufficient language that they need to be able to learn to read and write. So that was the starting point of the Now Play project. And I know that a concern for implications for children's language learning and development through highlighting understudied languages is the impetus for the Talk Together project as well. So there are parallels there. And you'll see that our goals are similar. We're looking at developing tools and approaches for assessing language. We're also looking at writing. It would be No Play, our acronym, if we didn't have the W in there. But also writing is a love of mine and my major research interest. We're focusing on children, on teachers and early childhood educators, on families and community caregivers in the northern remote communities. And we're also, as our research methodology, using collaborative action research. So all of the questions for our research come from the participants. We're calling them research practitioners. The teachers and early childhood educators that are involved meet with the university researchers. We travel to communities and after school, or if we can provide release, if there are substitute teachers available, we work during class time together. The teachers decide this is what we want to do using play to find out how this initiative, and it's usually something quite small as creating little signs and making it possible for children to create signs in the Sand Center, for example. And then the teachers record the children's interactions using an iPod Touch and a tripod so that they are out of the way, that we're getting the interactions among the children. And then the researchers and teachers meet about every 6 to 8 weeks, and we discuss what we are learning about children's language and their writing in these meetings. And then from there go on to plan other initiatives. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about some of the things that we have, some of the foci of our research. So in this case, we analyzed 3,400 utterances in video recordings of children's play. And as Joyce did, we looked at the purposes of the language. So here's some example of what the children were doing. We found that children described their own actions. They sort of talked themselves through whatever actions they were doing, which is well described in the literature. They also asserted, this is my purse, or they asserted, this is my space. We found that they gave rationales for their actions. You can just sort of imagine the child that's saying, because my defenses are super strong. The children explained because there was a lot of imaginary play. They had to explain to their peers what an object was representing. In this case, it was a bear and not a beagle. They played with sounds a lot, creating sounds for whatever objects they were using in their play, and then moving the story along. So using a lot of narrative knowledge in their imaginary pretend play. And from these analyses, we developed this tool assessing children's use of language, where we grouped the 36 purposes, specific purposes that we found in children's language in play, in the utterances that they used. And this tool has been used by teachers to get a sense of what children do when they are interacting with each other in play, what they do with language. And, you know, I was excited to see that Joyce is part of this study working with educators, because we are finding that speech language pathologists are such a valuable part of the Now Play project as well. And in fact, speech language pathologists in the schools have collaborated with the teachers using this tool. The SLPs are saying that they find this more contextualized understanding of children's language has really added to the information that they gather through the more standardized tests of children's language. So I'm just going to move quickly on to another way of looking at language, especially because the children in the play settings were using a lot of narratives. They were creating imaginative stories. And so then in over 100 minutes of play interactions that were recorded, we found some elements of cohesion. And the more that we examined these interactions in play settings, the more we came to realize how brilliant children are, how much they have learned already at a young age, 4 and 5 years old, in what they can do with language. So we found that children kept the story going along by using pronouns to refer to nouns that were previously identified when they were talking to each other. Sometimes they repeated words to get other people's attention and then to keep the flow of the play going so that the story didn't get disrupted. And they also used conjunctions sometimes at the beginning of sentences to show relationships. Either but or and were the most common conjunctions to show relationships with previous utterances, and again, to keep the play narrative moving forward. Another really brilliant use of language that we found children used a lot it was very common. Young children 4 years old up to 6 years old were using what's called face work. So they were saving their own face and they were saving others' face. And this was most often in terms of not seeming too bossy, because there was a lot of need for children to tell each other what they needed to do in order to keep the story going, to explain what was going on and who was playing what role, etc. And so the children often gave each other compliments. They softened demands, so they didn't seem too bossy. So they used the word just a lot to soften demands. They accepted correction sometimes. They apologized for what they were doing. They often gave an explanation. And again, they were saving face so that they didn't seem like there was something that they had done that was really wrong if they gave an explanation for what they were doing. And they did a lot of negotiating and often used tag questions at the end of whatever they were trying to get from someone else. So if they said, you can have this small toy, but I'm going to have the big one, okay? And we found that these uses of face work were very successful. They were successful strategies on the part of the children for being able to get others to do what they wanted to do or to be able to have or do what they themselves wanted to do. Another branch of our analysis of play interactions is looking not only at the language, but also at how children communicate using nonverbal communication. And in the case, I'm just going to give an example right now of two boys who in an Indigenous community, they were in an Aboriginal Head Start program, so they were 3 and 4 years old. They didn't use a lot of language, but they used nonverbal communication, and they were able to create a really large, interesting structure together without using language at all. And so once we saw that the children were using nonverbal communication, we came to see that when we're thinking about language, we don't want to just look at the actual words. We want to look at the other ways that children are communicating. And then I'm just going to close off by saying that we found that the collaborative action research and the teachers being part of the analysis of the language that children are using in their play was really helpful for their own professional learning, but also for recognizing that children really do have a lot of language, that they come to kindergarten and grade 1 with a lot of language and abilities to do amazing things with language as well. And so teachers were saying, you know, if I'm paying attention through looking at the videos and sort of the systematic analysis that they were doing with the university researchers of the children's language, if we pay closer attention, we come to see so much of the richness of children's language that we were missing out when we weren't engaged in these kinds of research activities. And I'm just going to close by saying thank you to the participating children and teachers and to the funding agency.